want to welcome you, and particularly Dr Khatidja Chantler from Wikan. This is another of the I4P talks for people who've not been to these events before. One of the reasons why the university set up the Institute for Public Policy and Professional Practice is to try to draw on the strengths and skills and knowledge across the university, across a whole wide variety of areas and disciplines. And over the past, I suppose, 10 months, we've had a number of visiting speakers talking about their particular research interests. This evening, Khatidja is going to talk on the issue of forced marriage. You'll know from the notes that you have that she's both a highly experienced researcher in the particular field, but also someone who has drawn down research grants from a variety of sources. So her work, often with colleagues, and I think you're probably going to make that point about working in collaboration with colleagues in other institutions of higher education, stretches back over a number of years, and she's drawing on work that was completed in 2007, am I right in thinking about that? To kind of shape and frame the discussion this evening. So as usual, Khatidja is going to speak for about 40 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A afterwards, and at some point in the future, this event will be available on the I4P website for you to share, use, have access to.
Okay. Thanks very much, John, and thanks for inviting me to come and speak about forced marriage today. My talk will cover 4 key areas today. The first is to provide a broad understanding of forced marriage. Secondly, to pay attention to the routes into forced marriage, according to survivors of forced marriage. What were their routes into those types of marriages? Then thirdly, to look at policy and professional engagement with the issue. And lastly, to kind of draw attention to the contradictory ways in which forced marriage is perceived in different policy arenas. And this can have particular implications for people who are trying to exit forced marriages. So I'm going to try and cover all those 4 areas. But I think a useful place to start is to kind of remind ourselves that forced marriage is actually an abuse of human rights. So from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and also CEDAW, which is, people who are working in violence against women field will be familiar with these instruments, if you like. So what's central, particularly in the first bullet point, you'll notice, is the issue of consent. So there needs to be full and free consent. And, on the surface, this sounds like a remarkably easy thing. You just say yes or you say no, and that's consent. But I think what you'll find through the presentation is that the concept of consent is actually quite slippery, and I'll be illustrating this through some of the survivor interviews so you can see what I mean. When you're researching any area, of course, the first question to ask is, what is it? What is the problem, and how is forced marriage conceptualized, defined, and so on? So I think what I want to say is that it's actually quite difficult to define forced marriage, especially from a practitioner perspective, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the government definition of forced marriage is where one or both parties are coerced into a marriage against their will and under duress. So again, the issue of consent is central to this definition. Also duress, and duress includes emotional, physical, financial, and other forms of violence. In policy discourses, forced marriage is presented as different to arranged marriages, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Also is the issue of how should we actually think about forced marriage? Should we just see it as an issue related to honour? So should we see it within the paradigm, if you like, of honour-based violence? Or should we kind of have a broader understanding? And lastly, there have been a number of government initiatives to try and combat forced marriage, and if we have time, we'll talk about some of those. So I think it's useful to start with the distinction between arranged and forced marriage. So the central premise here is where family introduce appropriate young people to each other. And what's considered appropriate are things like, language, religion, social class, employment, hobbies, siblings, and so on. And within practicing communities, these are currently called biodata. So if you're looking for a husband or wife for your child, you'd send out like this biodata, which is basically like a CV, and ask people, oh, do you know any good families who could kind of match these criteria? So these can be sent to a marriage broker, or alternatively just through networks within their communities. Now, from a Western perspective, such arrangements or this type of marriage practice can often be seen as devoid of romantic love, because it doesn't have that eyes across a crowded room, frissons of excitement and all the rest of it. So it can appear like that. But what I would draw attention to is increasingly people in the West are using dating websites to find partners. And when you use a dating website, what you're doing is exactly the same process as the biodata. So what you're doing is continually filtering, based on maybe geographical area or occupation or age or ethnicity or whatever filters there are. You're constantly choosing. So I suppose I'd question, that kind of, eyes meeting against in a crowded room type arrangement of romantic love when people are so often nowadays using dating websites. Courtship periods in South Asian communities in particular and Middle Eastern communities are usually quite condensed, so they're compared to Euro-American cultural practices, and generally cohabitation is frowned upon. So that's just kind of a general overview about the arranged marriage is where the young people have to consent, so they kind of will be introduced to somebody and will be able to say yay or nay. I'd like to know this person more, or I wouldn't. But I think, so whereas that's positioned as different to forced marriage, where people are coerced into marriage, I think actually the categories are not quite as distinct as is originally made out. So for example, if you were introduced to suitor number one and you said, no, this person isn't my cup of tea, then you're introduced to suitor number two and you say, no, this one isn't either, and you go on in that fashion and you get to number 10, I think patience would be wearing quite thin. Do you see what I mean? So there's a slippage there. And now if you think about the words of this young woman who was a participant in the Hester et al. Study, John said that I did work with other people, and this was at the University of Bristol with colleagues there. So she says, I had the choice to say, I wasn't forced into saying yes, but I think my parents didn't give me enough time, or they didn't, even though I was about 14, 15. That's no age to ask a girl, does she want to get engaged to someone? So, although she felt there was a choice at a level of a cultural expectation, she didn't feel that she had, much of a choice about that. And I think that this quote actually shows quite well the slippage between these two categories. So on the basis of this, some authors have suggested that rather than seeing arranged and forced marriage as two completely distinct categories, maybe a continuum approach better describes the lived realities of people in these contexts. But the continuum approach doesn't often leave room for romantic love, and I think that's another part of the continuum that needs to be there. Because any of you who are familiar with South Asian contexts will know that Bollywood films, which is the mainstay of entertainment, are full of romantic love. So it's not like romantic love doesn't exist in those cultures, but it's kind of carefully, it's kind of defined in particular ways, but it's definitely there. And if you had time, I'd show you a little clip of so you'd be convinced that that was the case. But anyway, okay, let's turn to look at forced marriage research in the UK. Since 2006, there have been a number of studies. Here's a list of them, but I'm not going to talk about each of them in turn. Instead, what I'm going to do is draw out some of the key themes of the studies and talk to those. Before we do that, I just want to say that given that there is a strong preference for quantitative data in policy circles and also in the hierarchy of research evidence, it's worth pointing out some of the basic difficulties associated with quantifying forced marriage. It's difficult to measure, and the reason it's difficult to measure is that there's kind of discussion about, well, at which point do you start counting something as a case of forced marriage? So, for example, if a young person says to a teacher, for example, nothing's happened, but I'm actually quite scared that, you know, something might be about to happen. And I think that my parents might be trying to force me into marriage. Does that count as a case of forced marriage? Or do you wait till the marriage has been contracted? Do you see what I mean? So in the Hester et al. Study, in the interviews that we did with police, they said that this was a real difficulty because if a young person phoned them and said, you know, I'm worried that something's about to happen, but nothing actually had happened, they didn't know whether to count that as a case, whether to flag it, whether to kind of, you know, put the process into motion. But what's important to note is that in most studies, as well as the Forced Marriage Unit, which is the national UK agency who you can contact if you're a practitioner and need support with anybody you're working with, they count the anxiety or concern that a young person has before the marriage, as well as after, as well as those who may be in a forced marriage and want to leave it. So it's across the range, but that makes counting particularly difficult. The information that's available is largely around South Asian communities, and this is for several reasons. Firstly, because they form the largest ethnic minority groups in the UK. Secondly, they're more settled than some of the newer communities and have quite a strong infrastructure, particularly of South Asian women's groups, some of which, like Southall Black Sisters, have had a key role in campaigns to bring the issue of forced marriage to the attention of government and to demand action around it. But the Kazmierski et al. Study in 2009 estimated that there were between 5,000 and 8,000 cases in the year that they looked at it. The Forced Marriage Unit also produces its own data of cases where they have intervened. By intervention, they mean just cases where they might have given advice to social workers or other professionals, but also cases where they've actually, you know, perhaps gone abroad and rescued somebody. So here are just some of the figures. What's important to note is that approximately 20% are male victims. You know, and often the issue around men as victims isn't engaged with, but 80% are women victims, female victims. On average, it's between 1,400 to 1,600 cases a year that the Forced Marriage Unit deal with. But it's generally recognised that this is an underreporting, you know, that not everybody who's involved in such an issue would necessarily contact anybody for help. I said I was going to look at some of the themes in the research, and first point is the lack of adequate recording of incidents of forced marriage, partly because of what I explained to you before about not knowing when to count something as a case, but also because of some definitional issues around forced marriage. And of the data that there is, the majority of victims are young South Asian women, but forced marriage actually happens in quite a wide range of communities, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I mentioned earlier that we need to pay attention to how an issue is framed or conceptualized, because how we understand an issue is going to influence how we then act upon it and how we intervene. So authors like Brandon and Hafiz are very clear that forced marriage is part of the honour-based paradigm. But other authors, including myself, would argue very strongly that forced marriage should be seen within a wider kind of paradigm of gender-based violence, and there are specific reasons for that, which I'll discuss. Also, in the literature, there is a lack of professional knowledge around forced marriage, and also a fear of intervening, which I'll also be talking about in a second. So, looking at the themes, and also based on my own research, these are some of the key concepts that have emerged from the studies. So, the issue of race anxiety, cultural privacy, cultural matching, culturalized thinking, the dangers of co-option in regard to feminisms, politics as shaping what can be spoken, and the intersections of practitioner, organisational and macro issues. And I'll be looking at some of these for the rest of the presentation. I'm going to start with the issue of political contexts, because if we try to consider violence against women generally from the perspective of the women who are experiencing it, I guess the first challenge is for victims to feel okay about approaching somebody for help, agencies for help. And here I suppose I wanted to draw attention of how the wider political processes can actually shape help seeking. So this is an older study, Batslier et al., in which I was one of the principal investigators. The Manchester Domestic Violence Helpline reported a drop in the number of Muslim women contacting the helpline post 9/11. And similarly, some of the women we interviewed in that research were Irish women who also said that in the times of the Troubles, it was quite difficult for them to contact agencies for help. In a later study, this is what this victim said. So if you can just read it. So I suppose, you know, what this excerpt reminds us is how that wider context in this quote intersects with Muslim identities, and how it's impacted on her ability to approach services or not feeling able to. And I think what it reminds us is that every time a community is demonized, whatever that community is, it's often the women in those communities who suffer the most in terms of not being able to approach agencies for help. Race anxiety, this was a term that we introduced way back in 2001. And it refers to the discomfort of practitioners whether they're social workers or youth workers or teachers, when they're working with issues of race, especially if they think that they might be trampling on cultural sensitivities. So what happens here is that practitioners are so scared and ashamed, really, of being labelled racist or culturally insensitive, that appears to stop their normal assessment processes, their normal judgments that they would bring to bear in situations of abuse. And so we call this race anxiety, and this, 2001 is a long time ago, but interestingly, this was also found more recently by the Ministry of Justice when they were looking at the issue of forced marriage protection orders. So, that seems to be an issue that's still out there. And also, if you think about the Rotherham, child exploitation, it was brought up there as well, that the police were afraid of intervening. And I think what happens in this dynamic is that practitioners are so concerned about culture that what they do is neglect issues of gender. And I think this is really dangerous for those victims in those communities who are experiencing violence and abuse. So, and the other issue is that what happens is that the abuse that women and children are experiencing in those communities comes to be seen as a cultural issue. And that's particularly problematic, both in the way that happens, but also if it's a cultural issue, then it's not seen as amenable to intervention. And that's very, very, very difficult and doesn't offer protection for those women and children in those communities. Now, obviously, there's been a lot of kind of cultural sensitivity training to help professionals to understand different cultures and to intervene more effectively. But I think there's also been an unintended consequence, and that's the one that we've been talking about privileging culture over gender. And also kind of assumes that cultures are static, that they're not dynamic, that they're not changing. And usually when people think about culture, they are thinking of, how can I put it? They will ask community leaders what the culture is. I'll just give you a small example. Many years ago, the police were wanting to do a consultation about South Asian communities. And they were saying to us, can you think of anybody who could be involved? I said, well, I could be. I'm South Asian. They said, oh, no, not people like you. And I said, I beg your pardon? What, do you see what I mean? It's just like, they were wanting a particularly traditional outlook on understandings of culture. So I think, this is just not very helpful. Within the honour-based violence, so shame and honour are the two things, or the kind of two things that are often badged, as cultural. And I think this is quite problematic. So if we just take the example of forced marriage on the one hand and date rape on the other. Forced marriage is often constructed as a cultural issue, kind of tied up with honour and so on. And it's seen as an intrinsic part of culture, whereas date rape isn't, is it? It's seen as an aberration of culture. It's very much more individualized. It's the bad apple rather than the whole culture. So, but what we do know from studies on sexual violence and prominent authors like Liz Kelly is that sexual violence and domestic violence in general should be understood as part of a process of unequal gender relations. So, that's a kind of structural understanding, yet when people talk about it, they talk about it in individualized terms. It's not part of the culture, it's not part of the environment we live in. And I think that's quite tricky. And in relation to forced marriage, one of the survivors who we interviewed, she said, after the interview, she said, well, are you going to go and interview Prince Charles now? Because wasn't he forced to marry Diana? Wasn't he always in love with Camilla? But did her family not think that Camilla wasn't appropriate because she was a divorcee, because she wasn't a virgin, and so on and so forth? So how are you constructing forced marriage? And I think that has actually stayed with me in terms of, you know, how she brought it to light. And that's why I'm sharing it with you. And also we must remember things like shotgun marriages. You know, it's not that long ago that if people were pregnant outside of marriage, that they were forced to marry the person or get rid of the baby, you know, through adoption or whatever. So it's, you know, it's just how, I think it's always interesting to think, how is something being framed and what is the purpose of that framing? What does it highlight and what does it make invisible? So honour and shame, are they restricted to particular communities? I mean, I'm also a therapist and I've worked with many victims of abuse from different backgrounds, and I wouldn't say that honour and shame are restricted to particular communities. If you've been a victim of abuse, then I think especially shame is something that, you know, goes across the board. So if we, I wasn't expecting to say that. Okay, so this kind of culturalised framing of forced marriage and violence against women in minority communities is very problematic, and I really like Shireen Razack's work, who's critiqued the work of Wikan. And what Razack centrally argues is that a lot of feminism, what it's done is that it takes on a position of being culturally superior. So its construction of women is that in majority communities, women are much more progressive and forward-thinking and can make choices and so on, and women in minority communities are passive and, you know, don't have those freedoms. And what Razack argues that cultural superiority that is inherent in some branches of Western feminism is problematic, and she critiques Wikan's work on three key bases. The first is that Westerners have values, i.e. they're liberal and egalitarian and democratic, whilst Muslims have cultures invariably constructed as oppressive. Her second point is that what happens is that over-determining culture in the way that I've discussed, what that does is it obscures some of the structural relationships that are based on race and class and also have a historical basis based on colonialism and so on. And thirdly, she argues that implicit in Wikan's work is the self-image of the West as somehow outside of culture. And I demonstrated that when we talked a little bit about date rape. So I think this is really important that we bear this in mind. And let's move on now to think about which communities does forced marriage occur in. So in our study, part of what we did was a mapping survey of community organisations in the three locations that we were conducting our study in, and the three locations were Manchester, Birmingham and Tower Hamlets in London. And we asked community organisations if they worked with victims of forced marriage, and if so, what the ethnicity of those victims was. So unsurprisingly, we found that most organisations dealt with South Asian people, but also Somali people, people from other African countries, Middle Eastern countries, Chinese communities, Latin American communities. So as you can see, it's much more widespread than just South Asian communities. Okay, so I think that's important, again, you know, to understand some of these differences. So for example, within the Chinese context, again in that study we conducted focus groups, and one of the focus groups was with Chinese students. And what they were saying was that forced marriage largely happens in rural areas and largely as a result of the one-child policy in China, because the one-child policy also intertwined with family preferences for a son rather than a daughter, means that there is an imbalance between men and women in China. So the proportions aren't kind of near 50-50. So that means young girls are often pressurized into marriage because there's a shortage of them. So, you know, it's important to understand the kind of wider implications of these things. There's also issues around learning disabilities and forced marriage, and I would direct you to this research by Anne Craft and the Judith Trust. And obviously some of the kind of, you know, we've been talking about consent, that there needs to be full and free consent, but if you're somebody with learning difficulties, do you have the capacity to consent? You know, all those sorts of issues become very important. Children and adults with learning difficulties are more abused in the first place than their peers. The motivation of parents can be very benign. You must understand that, but at the same time you can't over-identify with the parents. The parents might be wanting a carer for their son or daughter, but you can't really over-identify with that because it is still a breach of that person's human rights. And there are also some specific guidelines if you want to know more about that. I want to talk a little bit before we finish about routes into forced marriage. So financial issues, social, particularly in relation to gender inequalities, sexuality, particularly in relation to compulsory heterosexuality, child marriage and immigration. So I'll just quickly talk about this. So some of the women who we interviewed, mainly African women, there was a cultural practice of bride wealth in those communities, or bride price. And this is where the groom's family makes a gift to the woman's family. And so if you're very poor, and I mean very poor, that you haven't even got, that the family haven't even got enough food, and somebody comes along and says, for your daughter's hand, I will buy you X sacks of maize and give you a cow and this, that and the other. If you were the young woman in that family, your ability to make a full and free consent decision is heavily compromised by the context in which you are. So in this quote, the person says, poverty is the major thing. If she, prospective in-laws, gives money, the family won't ask for the young woman's consent. The money will buy rice for them. Because of money, they will send their kids for marriage. Okay, so what this alerts us to is the issue of poverty. So just thinking about things within an honour paradigm doesn't really work when you look at different women's experiences. That's important. Okay, so similarly, keeping with the bride wealth, I want to kind of tell you the story of Maria. This is her pseudonym. And she's a woman from Mozambique who told us of her childhood, which was filled with violence. She was one of 6 children in her family, and they didn't have the resources to educate them all. Maria would have desperately liked to have gone to college, but that just wasn't an option. But she was forced into marriage, and bride wealth played a part in that. So what happened in the marriage is that she also experienced a lot of violence within that marriage. So what she says was, I was pregnant at the time and he drinks. So one day I asked him where he was as I was taking his shoes off. You have to take his shoes off, socks off, everything. She's explaining this to me, you know. Sometimes soak his legs, and I asked him where he was and he didn't reply. So I asked him again, and the next thing he hit me on my face. I couldn't believe this. And again, the next one. I didn't say anything. He said, "How dare you ask me? I didn't get married so you could ask me. You live under my roof. You have to obey my rules. Your father knows you are here. You were given to me." And I kept quiet. So I prepared the food, still crying, and he ate and went to bed. So, as her story kind of evolved, what became clear is that she didn't actually feel that she could leave this marriage because she felt that she would have to repay the bride price, and she really didn't have the money. She's from Mozambique. How did I get to interview her in this country? Well, her husband was a doctoral student at a university, and she was here as a spouse attached to his visa, so actually leaving the relationship would have been extremely difficult, other than the bride price, which was something that she felt she had to pay. Her immigration status meant that she was actually trapped in that relationship as well, because she was subject to no recourse to public funds. However, she did in the end, because she feared for her life and that of her children, did make a call to the police and was assisted. But no recourse to public funds is a major barrier to women leaving such relationships. This is another of the survivors. I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She was, again, forced into marriage in an African country. The reason she was forced into marriage was also around bride wealth, but also because she was a lesbian. And her family didn't want other people to know that she was a lesbian, and they felt that if they got her married off, then that would iron out the bumps of her sexuality, so to speak. So she comes to this country, she manages to escape. She did get married. She described sex within that marriage as rape. She did have a child within that marriage. She escaped with that child, came to the UK and claimed asylum. So what do you think happened to her asylum claim, on the grounds that A, she was a lesbian, and B, she was forced into a marriage because of her sexuality? Rejected. It wasn't believed. So this is an illustration of how forced marriage is treated differently in different policy arenas. So on the one hand, while we say it's an abuse of a person's human rights, when it comes to claiming asylum, that's a different kettle of fish altogether. So what she says was, even if this country reject me, I don't know where I will go. It will be my dead body going back to Africa. I tried to commit suicide twice. I keep a diary in case, and leave it where someone can find in case I die. I will kill myself before I go back to Africa. I'm ready for that. It's really too much. At any time they can call me and say, we're going to deport you. I live life by the day. And don't forget, she has a young child. But that, you know, because she saw that child as a product of rape, you could argue that the attachment issues weren't quite as they should have been. This is to illustrate, you know, both how forced marriage is treated differently in different policy arenas, but also some of the impact of forced marriage. And linked to that, of course, is the issue of a compulsory heterosexuality. Well, feminism, Adrian Rich, etc., have been, you know, have coined this term, compulsory heterosexuality. But here is some other interviewees who are gay. The first is a gay man who said, I will take that one step further and say, in what community do we not see the pressure of marriage? Yeah, I would say that we as a society are trained from a very young age to believe that there are particular roles we need to fulfill. And the other aspect of our life is that we want to fulfill those roles. So this was a gay man who told his parents when he was 18 that he was gay. And they kind of, you know, didn't say much about that, you know, and then a couple of years later started saying, well, perhaps you should get married now, you know. And he was saying, no, but I'm gay. I don't want to get married. And no, they didn't say to him, shall we find you a nice Indian boy? They didn't do that, because he is a man. So, but his story was that he was sitting in Mumbai airport and happened to strike up a conversation with an Indian woman, and it transpired that she was a lesbian, and they were pretty much in the same situation, and they wondered whether they should get married to each other and then be able to lead their own lives, you know, as gay people, but it would provide the cover. In the event, the person we interviewed said this just didn't feel right for him, you know, that it was taking away part of his identity and he couldn't go through a marriage like that. He was gay, he had a long-term partner, and that's who he wanted to be with openly. And then this, I'm running out of time, aren't I? So I'll try and be quick. So in this next quote, it's, I guess for me, I wouldn't necessarily see that as just peculiar to this community meaning South Asian community. I think that's happened in white communities and majoritized communities as well. If you get married, then that will iron out all the bumps of your sexuality, so to speak. And frankly, that's saying, isn't it, all she needs is a good, then there was an F word, husband, wedding, etc. You know, so I think, you know, the participants in our study did kind of, you know, they were very clear that this compulsory heterosexuality got in the way of their life choices. Child marriage, so if a 16, 17-year-old is marrying a 45-year-old, you know, we need to think about that. And UNICEF has just produced a report on child marriage, defined as a marriage contracted under the age of 18. Of course, in the UK, you can get married at 16 with parental consent. And also, I think we have to question what is a child, because, you know, it's not everywhere in the world that children can get to go to school. Many are working to support their own families. So the notion of what is a child and what is childhood and how is that constructed are all relevant issues. Immigration was one of the other routes. All the policy and so on focuses on British victims. What it doesn't look at is people from abroad being forced into marriage. So some of the women we interviewed had been forced into marriage from countries like Pakistan, and they were sold this image of Britain being paved with gold on the streets and, you know, be living in luxury and so on. And of course that's not the case at all. So for example, in the case of one woman who was, you know, although she said she wasn't she didn't say yes and she didn't say no, but the marriage went ahead. When she came here, she was forced to work in her in-law's garment factory all hours of the day and didn't get paid at all. So, you know, this streets of gold just didn't pan out for her. Okay, just want to finish by talking about the impact of forced marriage, particularly in relation to self-harm and suicide. You saw from the story I told you before and the quote you saw before about the woman who wanted to take her life, and this is from another study where the survivor says it's like something comes into you. You don't feel scared of killing yourself. You get so fed up, so much abuse, you don't care about anything, how much you're going to hurt yourself. There have been times I would have liked to stab myself, but they'd hidden all the knives. I was craving for a knife to put inside me, just wanted to finish myself. No other way out. I was always thinking about killing myself, feeling I had to. It was like I was in hell. And she was age 15, and this was her second forced marriage. So she was somebody who was born in this country, was in the care of the local authority, was returned to her family at 13, was taken abroad, forced into marriage, managed to get back, escape from that, and then was taken back again at age 15. So I think this was 2001 when she was telling her story. I don't know how much things might have improved by then. Self-harm also emerged in our more recent study, but also Buyertal conducted a review of literature on rates, risk factors and methods, and they found a link between what they termed arranged marriage and self-harm. Okay. So, if we were concluding, I think that what we should really pay attention is to the routes into and out of forced marriage, because I think the accounts I've given you of survivors illustrate that it's wider than South Asian, it's wider than culture. We need to think about issues of compulsory heterosexuality, and to be aware of how legitimate concerns of violence against women and forced marriage can be co-opted by the state to introduce, for example, racist, or what can be perceived as racist immigration legislation in a bid to prevent forced marriage. So, for example, the government wanted to raise the age at which you could marry a non-EU citizen. So they said that that was to prevent forced marriage, but other people would feel very strongly that that was just a bid to limit numbers of migrants coming to the UK. I think the mental health impact of forced marriage should not be underestimated. And in the times of austerity, particularly, we need to be wary, because a lot of voluntary sector organisations, particularly black women's organisations, are being closed, and they actually have quite a lot of expertise on this topic. Okay. I'm going to stop now. But
I'm interested in the safeguarding issues of the children.
Right.
When you conducted the research, and you mentioned the lady from Mozambique and the child, she was pregnant and child, how do you get around the safeguarding issues as like the prime researcher at that stage?
Well, when she was pregnant, she was in Mozambique at that time, so she was recalling what had happened, and by the time I was interviewing her, she had already left. So thank goodness for that, because otherwise it would have been a very sticky situation. But yes, obviously you have to have the normal kind of protocols around safeguarding and inform people on the participant information sheet that where there are child safeguarding issues, their confidentiality cannot be, cannot be kept.
Khatidja, thank you very much. That was a very interesting and illuminating talk. I was particularly interested in that concept of race anxiety, reported by practitioners, which kind of prevented practitioners from intervening. And I think you said that in forced marriages, the cultural issue is seen above the gender issue. I just was thinking as you spoke on, how much of that is the case, is it a case of othering still happening, othering further minoritised groups? Because in my field of education, Professor Dave Gilbourne talks about the notion of othering and maintaining stereotypes advantages the majority. So he talks about model minorities like Asian and Chinese children being, the best achievers. He actually draws that out and says, well, how does the sustenance of those models and that othering actually influence the majority? And I don't know if you want to pick up any issues on that.
I mean, I think in some of talking about the positive models, if you like, that are used in this type of discourse, I think particularly in the case of African Caribbean women who we interviewed, they felt that the perception amongst professionals is that they are strong, so they can cope with all kinds of stuff that comes across their way. And if you think about in terms of child protection, and think about a child called Sakina Hammond in particular, whose grandma was African Caribbean and was looking after her. One of the, again, this issue of, well, she was a strong woman, she could manage what was happening. So I think, positive role models can also be used in a way which doesn't offer protection, as well as the ones of kind of, certain women as passive and not approaching agencies for help. I think in terms of the stereotypes, my own view, and I don't know whether that's shared in the room, is that given the kind of increasing hostility in the media and taken up by politicians, that actually the climate is actually worse but it's spoken about less. So there's a kind of dual thing going on, although the other thing is that maybe race anxiety isn't an issue anymore, because now it's okay to be open and say those people are this and those people are that. I don't know, I'd be really interested in your own views as a group about that.
Just a question though, really, about this issue. I was speaking to another person about the topic of today, and he was saying that he wasn't sure that it would change the mindsets of the people who actually indulge in forced marriages themselves and doing this. What's the best way to actually try and maybe change the attitudes of the people who are actually involved in this? I mean, you have a very educated audience here, and you know they're obviously quite open-minded. They're here and listening to you, but perhaps we're not the people that you want to change the mindset. So what's the best way of tackling that without coming across as prescriptive, or perhaps in a way that would actually work?
Well, I think there are several strands to that answer. It's a shame you missed some of what I said before, because I was saying that culture and honour aren't the only lenses through which to understand forced marriage, but there are also issues such as compulsory heterosexuality, poverty, immigration issues, and so on. I mean, I could say to you, well, the kind of normal response to your question would be, is let's go and work in the communities. You know, let's start at, you know, with parents and grandparents and kind of illustrate why issues such as forced marriage are wrong. On the other hand, I could say to you, well, actually, because marriage is one of the only legitimate ways for non-EU citizens to enter the UK, perhaps there's something also about state structures which facilitate issues such as forced marriage. Do you see what I mean? So the pat response would be, let's go and work with communities. A more sophisticated analysis would say, actually, let's look at the different components that generate the conditions for forced marriage and intervene at all the different levels.
I think you mentioned on one thing where you said that they're thinking of raising the age, or the government was thinking of that. But from what I understand, do they try and prevent doing this by making sure that the person bringing them has an adequate amount of money and a salary as well? Do you think that's an effective mechanism to try and prevent this? Because from what I understand, that there's an effect, you need an actual amount that you're earning before you can.
Well, there's two issues. The first is the raising of the age, and actually the Hester et al. Study that I referred to was a study that we were commissioned to do precisely to find out if the government should raise the age. We recommended that they shouldn't, but they decided they would do it anyway. But in the end, this had to be overturned because of a Supreme Court ruling saying it was a breach of human rights. So, you know, the age issue was different, and the government argued at that time that raising the age to 21 would allow people to go to university, for example, would allow people to be more financially independent, and so on. So that was that. Current regulations have increased the amount of money that you have to be earning in order to bring a non-EU spouse into the country. So, you know, what that means is you can fall in love, for example, but only if you're wealthy.